zapraszam na panel badawczy. Wczoraj wieczorem
I would like to welcome you to a research panel. We talked a bit about research yesterday. We will be continuing that conversation now from a somewhat different angle. With us are Professor Anna Zarychta, a prorector for
teoretyk literatury i mediów, redaktorka i autorka licznych publikacji poświęconych kulturze. Dzień dobry pani
for
profesor.
arts.
Jest z nami też Adam Czarnecki.
Also with us is Adam Czarnecki, sociologist, doctor of economics, co-founder and deputy president of the Research Institute ARC Rynek i Opinia, for several years an academic, one of the academic staff of the main School of Economics in Warsaw, and the author of many publications in marketing and marketing research. Małgorzata Steciak will look at research from yet another perspective. Project manager in cinematic VR, journalist, copywriter. She has led and coordinated projects devoted to film, VR and AR applications, including for Atrium Poland. At the Marshal's Office of Lesser Poland Voivodeship and the city of Rzeszów, she has published her articles in a number of leading newspapers and journals. Dagna Kidoń, quite well known to those attending the school. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Łódź School of Social Science, graduate of the film department at the Łódź Film School. For the VN Lab, she does research on the reception of modern art using eye tracking. For the Perception and Audience Studies Studio, which has prepared this panel. She is also a producer for the Film Essay Studio. She has been working at the Łódź Film School for a number of years, organizing international projects, meetings and workshops in Poland and around the world. She is the Erasmus Plus coordinator. She also works for the Film Index Studio, where she deals with film production and distribution, and the moderator of this panel, a doctor, Professor Magdalena Sobocińska, who specializes in the cultural sphere, consumption development using internet for marketing, marketing communication, marketing research, and sustainable development. The author and co-author of over 200 publications, including monographs, chapters, and chapters in textbooks, as well as articles. For her PhD, Consumer Behavior on the Culture Goods Market, she received an award from the Minister for Science and Higher Education. Her habilitation work, entitled The Underpinnings and Perspectives for Developing a Market Orientation in Cultural Institutions, received a distinction from the Committee of Organization Science of the Polish Academy of Sciences. She is a member of the Polish Academic Marketing Society. And by that token, I would like to give the floor to our panelists. Thank you very much. I am greatly honored to be meeting with you to talk about technoculture and tell you what sorts of changes we're seeing in the behavior of audiences and how this impacts market research. Thank you so much to the panelists for agreeing to be with us today. Thank you, Mrs. Prorector, a doctor, and Małgosia, who will be talking about VR and the challenges of production. And she also has deeper insight into eye tracking research. So, first of all, a few words on the types of research conducted at our studio. Then Dagna will take over, And then I will ask the prorector to give us a broader overview, and afterwards Dr. Czarnecki to comment on the changes on the market as new communication technologies come into play and changes in terms of communication. So we are taking as our point of departure the research done here at the school, and then we will also look at other sectors and other industries. Let's start with technological determinism, which is an important construct for us because we're talking about technoculture and online marketing. The new technologies create a lot of opportunities, challenges, but also threats in terms of production, distribution, and promotion, publicity. Here we could talk about whether technology is the most important force driving modern culture, or is it merely one of the forces shaping social and economic life. The point is not to determine whether we are for the soft or hard option, but we'll be talking about technology in the communication era, the computer era, the automatization era. Technology has a huge impact and everybody feels the consequences. Some numbers. What is particularly important for this research is that modern cultural participants live in a culture of excess. Over 400 hours of content are streamed within a minute on YouTube. We are also seeing an acceleration, whereas radio needed 35 years and TV needed 13. The internet only needed 4 years to amass an auditorium of 5 billion. Since we're talking about the world scale, here are some world statistics. 35% of the world population, these are not internet users. Since Friday, we've been talking about VR technology or AI, but 1 in 3 people do not have access to the internet. So there are disparities. Of course, in Europe, this penetration of the internet is very high. It's almost 90%, or North America, over 93%. But on a world scale, 1 in 3 people does not have access to the internet. Before the pandemic, Poles went to the cinema less than once per year. So the question I often ask myself is, how is it possible to impact the culture participant, the consumer, to find a niche for these new works, whether they're mere entertainment or more ambitious avant-garde works? This is the question we ask ourselves. And the modern consumer is a complex consumer, internally torn, full of contradictions. And so, interestingly, for researchers, there are certain opposite trends that we see in terms of cultural consumer behavior. So, on the one hand, access to global products, homogeneity, but at the same time, internet banking, niches. Internet echo chambers. More amateur created culture. The co-creation of value, participants, users, consumers can create value for the authors, the producers, and all those in the art world. We also see the dematerialization of consumption. So we're consuming impressions, experiences, building signs, semiotics. We're buying brands, Netflix. We're buying brands, but at the same time, culture based no longer on ownership is developing side by side with ownership culture. Access culture is developing as virtualization deepens. Access to the work is more important to some people than owning it. These technology-driven changes also mean, I won't stress that there are no longer divisions into day and night or working days versus weekend. They're not so clearly marked anymore. But there's a sense that accompanies consumers that the speed of life is faster, too fast almost for some. Consumers know that they won't be able to watch, read, see everything. Since the beginning of our panel, so and so many hours of online content has been put up online. It's not always art, but content broadly understood. Technology is also important in the context of culture because it impacts all processes, all stages of production and consumption, and the user can also pursue all these stages online, finding information, choosing an offer, online consumption, or expressing his or her opinion about what they've seen, rating what they've seen, which I remember several years ago, Englert said that today's authorities are prosumers, YouTubers. So it's also interesting to see how the consumer rates the work or the content he has encountered. Echo said painting did not die when photography emerged, so this doesn't mean that there's one model of participation in culture. We have various models, hybrid models, and models in which the internet is used to find information about the author, whereas the actual consumption does not have to be online. Since the consumer is overstimulated, his attention is selective. Some messages only reach those with certain needs, who feel certain needs. Aside from that, internet echo chambers. So how do we communicate? How do we distribute work in this multi-distribution world? The pandemic also strengthened certain trends like virtualization, but the trends have also become more complex. Without going into the methodology, but also thank you to Adam for the opportunity to carry out our research via his agency. I want to emphasize that this was research done both with creators, individual interviews and focus studies, as well as research on large representative samples of consumers. So I will be presenting research also among those decision makers in cinemas, theaters, festivals, streaming platforms. So here we had a sample of 321 decision makers in cultural institutions. So the first, a bit of research. Those interviewed are geared towards the needs of the user. As Hibner said, the director has to go and sit in the audience. So the decision makers often do go and sit in the audience and try to cater to the audience, to the public. Secondly, towards creators, cultural staff. Let us note that from the marketing perspective, what's important is that priorities in managing cultural institutions. Marketing and marketing technologies are supposed to facilitate relation building. I think this is evidence of a quite high managerial awareness. It's not an art to get the user. The point is to keep them. So they also, as one of the priorities indicated, was to obtain new consumers of culture, making sure the offer is high quality. That was also one of the priorities for decision makers. So moving on to the internet. The majority have a strategy. So they treat their online presence as something that is long-term and very significant. 1 in 2 works with bloggers or YouTubers. But at the same time, 1 and 2 cultural institutions send out newsletters. With regard to publicity, online publicity, almost everybody has a website. Social media, mostly Facebook. This is no surprise. It's been around for longest. It's almost outdated, you could say, with people leaving Facebook. Fewer institutions have YouTube channels or use apps like TikTok. Only 10% of the respondents have accounts on Vimeo. There's also high potential for research using online tools. Cultural institutions tend to use the internet to get information by observing the online community, but this observation is more qualitative because only 35% use specialized tools like analytics, specialized analytics are not yet common on the Polish cultural market. With regard to VR or AR, these two technologies, I wish to emphasize that VR is more commonly used than AR, and somewhat more often it is used for artistic purposes rather than for publicity campaigns. So this is research on a sample of 1,000 culture consumers. What sort of benefits come from using VR to these people? First of all, you can enter an unreal world. So here, this was marked 5.4 out of 7. Good fun, 5.4. So the same, and 5.3 interactivity, so entering a world that reflects reality. With regard to barriers, so the same respondents said, the same 1,000 people said that the lack of access to VR, the high price of the equipment, and hygiene. Because, for instance, a museum, if it wants to use VR technology, they have to make the goggles or whatever equipment available to several people. This was significant during the pandemic. Returning to the research on decision makers, social media are more of a place for PR, creating one's image and setting up relations rather than a space where you find inspiration or involve the user in the process of modifying your offer. So they tend to approach it in a more classical, traditional manner. 11 institutions, or out of the 131, decision makers did not use social media. And the biggest barrier was the lack of a staff person to handle that. Again, I'd like to now refer to the role of AI in managing culture. So in our project, we look at technoculture in a broad understanding. According to respondents, AI as an advisor in medicine, it's a fact that algorithms are sometimes more effective in diagnosing than doctors with a lot of experience under their belt. I recently read that in America, where they have case law, law firms are investing heavily in AI when it comes to researching cases. The programs are often more effective than good lawyers. With regard to culture, man, the human person, is still at the center. It's not merely a question of authorship rights. The law might change, it might evolve, but there's a human creator So, to the question, what sort of role can AI play in managing culture? The respondents said, well, it can be an advisor, it can make recommendations, but it's the human who makes decisions and decides to what extent the advice should be taken. Somebody said AI was an external contractor of sorts. Some tasks could be delegated or outsourced to AI. Institutions like Netflix not only invest in AI and improve their algorithms because they're not perfect, but also train and spend twice as much to train staff on how to integrate human talent with AI. How to build a coexistence between these human and artificial resources. Artificial intelligence, more artificial than intelligent, some said. On the Polish market, and this comes as no surprise, these were museums, cinemas, festivals, art galleries that we interviewed. They used very little AI, but 40% of them stated that it wasn't necessary. Crowdfunding is also something that we looked at in public, private, and non-profit institutions. It's not just about getting financing, but also about getting people involved. So crowdfunding as a type of publicity. I also want to emphasize that the pandemic accelerated certain processes. The assessment of cultural institutions moving online, and they did so in different ways, some not to lose their audiences, others to create tighter relationships, others went online to create something that wouldn't have come about if not for the pandemic. Others went online to give people access to the digital world. But importantly, a large percentage, 63%, believe that it was a positive experience because going online was a positive experience. They consolidated their connection to the user. Others found new consumers. And there are also hybrids that have emerged. After the end of the pandemic, 53% of respondents said that, in their opinion, online internet use will increase. So we see accelerated virtualization, which is here to stay, and it's growing. It's also worth noting that the skills that they believed needed developing, according to the managers, so not just staff training, developing staff, also using new technologies to promote their work. So these are just some excerpts of our research to give you an overview. And now I would like to ask Dagna, because you conducted research on the reception of works using new technologies and eye tracking. I would like you to present your findings from your project.
Dzień dobry. Tylko otworzę sobie prezentację. Okej. Tak, czy można jakoś inaczej pokazać? Na pełen ekran? No nic, dobrze, jak najwyżej poproszę o pomoc później. A nie, dobrze, to jest na pełen ekran. Tak, ja bym chciała przedstawić.
I would like to present not so much the findings of the studies I've been carrying out, but I wanted to share some thoughts regarding the methodologies that I use and the state-of-the-art technology that has been discussed At the perception, at the laboratory of perception and audience research, I use eye tracking, stationary and mobile, and I wanted to show you the pros and cons, the strengths and weaknesses of that technology in the context of academic research, scientific research, specifically as regards art, because that's what interests me most. As has been said, I study the perception of contemporary art. By way of an introduction, I feel I should mention, I should say what eye tracking is, because mental problems. Eye tracking follows the gaze. It follows our gaze and maps it onto a frame. This is an example taken from my research. We see the gaze of the research subject, whose gaze looked at a sculpture, and the main assumption of oculography, the main premise, is that the gaze reflects a thinking process. The way we look at an artwork, the parts that we highlight, that we notice, are relevant because that tells us what is important, what we focus on, and eye tracking allows us to verify that, to check that, as well as how much time we spend looking at an artwork. All these parameters, the trajectory of the eyeball, are indicators of mental processes. They give us an insight into what people are thinking. All the sensory data that eye tracking can detect. Although let me say that these are purely physiological parameters. So whereas I can check what part of an artwork was most interesting, most absorbing, most intriguing, but I can't really establish why that was important. You can't do that with eye tracking. For that, you need to triangulate data. You need to look at qualitative and quantitative data. You can do an interview, a poll, a survey. So that was my first conclusion. Off the cuff, just so you need more in-depth research. In marketing research, and perhaps you can tell us more about that. That might not be that important. Perhaps it would be, it's enough to map or see where the gaze falls, but I wanted to learn more. So speaking of marketing, oculography is used first and foremost in marketing research, and the way people look at shelves and products in stores. Another interesting area is user experience. For instance, looking at how people use applications on a phone or on a computer to check whether the page is functional and user-friendly. What I'm interested in is academic research, a context that is emerging, that is becoming more widespread. Oculography is being used by psychologists and special education. The cognitive sciences are using this instrument. I'm a sociologist, an art sociologist. That's my area, and we're just taking the first steps to see what the technology is capable of. This gives us a lot of interesting areas to explore, but it also has its shortcomings. You have two trackers. We have two trackers that we use. This is a stationary tracker. It's an infrared panel under a screen. These are the basic parameters, the specs of the tracker. So we place a subject before a screen and subject them to stimuli. Then you have a mobile tracker, glasses, which you put on and you move around a space. So what this second type, the glasses-based tracker, gives you the advantage. I mean, we can place a research subject in a natural space. So for me, in my case, I invited them to attend an exhibition, to view an exhibition. Everybody was given a pair of glasses and they could look at the artwork. This should have, you should have the points where the person was looking. So did they look at the caption? How much time did it take? Was it important? Did they interact with the work in any way? Not everybody did that. Some people looked at this work from afar. Some people put their head into the opening and they looked differently. They experienced the work differently. So that gives you a very interesting effect because you can get into the mind of a research subject and see the world through their eyes, see how they move around space, how they explore, how they interact with other people in the room. So that's very interesting. It's interesting to get a glimpse of someone else's mind. I mean, I won't get into their mind entirely, so you need to interview them, what they found interesting, what their thoughts are. One thing that is an important advantage of both the stationary and the mobile tracker, and this is not something I expected, because it's appealing. Because today it's difficult to find research subjects when doing classical research in big cities. People are generally tired of getting phone calls, telemarketing, where people try and sell you kitchen utensils, and in your phone your phone can sift through or block spam, so there is some resistance, but being told that this is a study using technology is appealing, and that's a sense I had. That was one of the first observations I had, that this is interesting. It has novelty. It has novelty value. A disadvantage, a problem is related to mapping the gaze. To what extent the program can map our gaze onto a frame. That's not perfect. I'm sure progress will be made. The software is getting better. We have the technology, we have the software, 3 or 4 years old. In technology, that's a generation, obviously, but so sometimes you need to map. Sometimes if a piece of software can't superimpose or map something onto an image, it has to be done manually. So you have to plot the points. It's a problem for me as a sociologist because I see it as intervention. I can't really click in the exact same place, so it's a distortion on the part of the scholar, the observer, and especially when time, distance are important. So here, this was a problem we ran into, and also the way people turn their heads. If people move their heads, it blurs the image, or if they move around an object, then it can be a problem for some software, or something banal, like making sure that I'm not talking about lighting, But for instance, this lady here had her hair undone, so her hair blocked the camera and got into the way, and I soon learned that you have to look after the details, you have to make sure that people have their hair combed back, and then there's also calibration, issues of technology, issues of hardware. For instance, here the mapping is a little shifted, and those red blotches correspond to places where the person looked most often. So you can imagine that these points should be in the so it's shifted. The person was actually looking at the capital letters, and with stationary eye trackers, the advantage is that you have a greater degree of control. You have a computer, you have the same setting, so it's more standardized to a greater extent. And the mapping, the results are more accurate. Something I found interesting and important was that in this case you can determine and select your own set of stimuli, the images you want to show research subjects, because when doing a study in a museum, I had to work with what was available in a given museum, what was on display. But in stationary research, I can pick whatever artworks works that are in collections in New York or Amsterdam, and also sequence them in whatever order I want. So that was a clear advantage. But the disadvantage, there's pros and cons, is that this hardware was very sensitive. The calibration was difficult. You had to, even flashes on the wall or sunlight falling on the wall, the panel didn't know where the eyes were located, whether it was back on the wall that was being illuminated. So you need to be relatively critical of the findings because you can overinterpret. We had a lady, for instance, who, as it turned out, clearly had an eye defect that she wasn't aware of, because, she never looked at the actual figures. She's always looking somewhere in between. And this was true for all the measurements. So, again, I'm not a doctor. I'm not sure if it's myopia or some other illness, some other condition. I know that in Poland we have tracking experience on the way architecture is perceived, and respondents are previously tested for eye defects, whether they have astigmatism, for instance, or anything that might that might distort the research findings. And it is very interesting using these instruments. There's a lot of leeway. You can do a lot with this technology. You can put it to various uses. Professor Zarychta will be telling us more about that, perhaps. So there's a lot of ideas, and together with my team and I will be continuing this research, we'll be pursuing it. There's a lot of elements, a lot of conditions that need to be met. Individual, subjective, objective, or in terms of setting. So you do need to bear that in mind. All these issues that I've mentioned, and it's not an independent instrument in terms of my needs. I do qualitative research, and it's a comment. So it is something that's an interesting first step. It's an element that needs to be complemented using traditional instruments, in interviews, questionnaires, if you want full, more in-depth findings. I hope next year perhaps to present my research findings more extensively. Thank you very much, and congratulations on your research. What Darna said, there's no perfect method. Some of them are best suited for a given set of circumstances. So you have to select those methods which are most adequate, best suited to your purposes. So a combination of methods, triangulation, because just one look, I mean, oculography tells us a lot. We know what people looked at, but we don't know what they thought. And obviously, culture is something we respond to affectively, emotionally, as we said in yesterday's panel, and people can't necessarily express or verbalize what they feel, but culture does shape attitudes, so it's also relevant. We also need to look at more tangible cognitive data. So combination of various methods is a strategy that scholars, researchers should definitely adopt. That's true, because the one supplements the other. I'm currently analyzing all the data I have obtained, and either they complement one another, or they replicate. Or if somebody says, for instance, that a given part of an artwork was important, then that's corroborated in the recording, or sometimes in the recording you see a point, a part of an artwork that most people have noticed, looked at, but it's not necessarily explicitly stated by people who might not even realize that a given part of a work was important, that they paid attention to it, not in terms of semantic analysis, but it was something that they noticed, whose form they noticed. So it's interesting how it builds on, the one builds on the others. So we're the eyes of our research subject, and having this insight tells us about how people see art. Okay, this is being done more often, and if we look at fixation or other gaze fixation, this is standardized. If we know that if someone pauses, it's not because it's fascinating, it can be difficult. So this is a discipline that's developing, that's growing, and the indicators, even though is becoming standardized. All this research was possible thanks to the Dean of Studies, who headed the workshop that initiated this research, and she Anna Zarychta. Yes, and now we see the results, the effects. So perhaps you're here to comment on that. I had the idea when we were designing the VN Lab project to purchase equipment, to buy eye trackers, stationary, mobile, portable, as well as face reading software, and shimmer, allowing us to study the emotions that people feel. I never expected that this idea would follow in the the footsteps of bio and techno-determinism, because I had people telling me that this would kill art. Even before I bought the hardware, I was facing accusations when people saw what it was like. Only a handful of artists approached me saying they wanted to check something, but there was resistance basically, and this was surprising because I felt that we should know how this is used, not just to study art, but also in different cognitive research, how perception is understood, how the processes of perception, which do not have to impact our artistic decision. And this impact is unconscious, intuitive, or it's the function of cultural tradition. So scholars in neuroaesthetics or neuroart history, or broadly speaking, neuroscience, cognitive research, are in a dispute with art historians who also raise the question of biodeterminism, but they say that painters and sculptors, when writing handbooks, Da Vinci's treatise on painting, so they were aware of how the mind responded. They were aware of the existence of processes of perception. We can verify Leonardo's claim that everything that simulates emotion can affect our mind. Piotr Francuz at the Warsaw Museum claims that people look at everything that glistens in a painting, jewelry, bridles, glistening fur on a dog. And Pindarus wrote in his invocation to Thea, said, "O goddess of the sun, who taught us to worship and love everything that glistens, everything that gleams." So even the ancients knew how it worked. I hoped that this research would allow us, in a very functional way, to check a number of issues, how people behave in a museum, whether they read the captions, the titles, and how large the captions should be, where they should be located, how long an introductory text should be. Of course, not everybody will read that, and there's a lot of variables. Many people wearing eye trackers read captions that they wouldn't have read otherwise. So later on, they admit that they had never been as attentive as they were when wearing a portable eye tracker. So these are things that we need to be aware of. This research will never be unambiguous or easy to interpret. We also thought about studying the film frame or stills and to use in teaching to show students hands-on how theory translates into the way we view a film frame. We're also thinking of using this research to study perception of and reception of art, contemporary art, but also the relation of text and image in handbooks and on websites about art. So the more functional dimension that would allow us better to design handbooks. The research we're doing leads us to findings that we had never anticipated in people. Pay attention to something that we had never expected, which is a great stimulus. It motivates us to head in different directions, to pursue different areas of research and ask questions that had not been asked in art history or film studies, because people weren't aware that there was a need, or that these responses existed and what causes them. I hope that gradually the art world, the arts and humanities community will buy into this, although we had never intended to have bio or techno determinism. So thank you very much. Now, what I think is crucial here is that this research has a scientific academic purpose, goal, but it can also be applied. We're trying to understand viewers. I'm learning about people, and people are still an open book. So this application, it's not about artists making artworks according to conform to a certain model, but I think that artists will agree that if we know more about viewers or spectators, it'll be easier to promote or to market something. So there is, so it has cognitive but also applied learning value. Artworks are a value unto themselves, but it's autotelic. It's a value in and of itself, and it's difficult to set limits to the imagination, to human inventiveness. However, every work is made in order to be read or viewed, and it doesn't detract from the value of an artwork if we have a well-phrased caption, a well-phrased description that's appropriate. So there's a lot of advantages, and I think artists will come around because they do care about spectators and viewers or readers. So thank you once again. And now, speaking of research, and we were talking about research done at the lab, research on art, I think it's a good time for the president of a research agency, Adam Czarnecki, to tell us what it looks like from his point of view, because you do market research. And we were wondering how technology changes research, what new research techniques, methods have emerged in marketing. And we also asked ourselves whether technology can replace a market researcher, whether this research is always very individualized and can also be creative. So the links and art and science overlaps here. So perhaps you'd like to say a few words. Do you have a presentation or?
So maybe without the presentation, since we are more in a discussion formula. So let me take off from this mention of the research on reception. We have studied film. We've done research on film on many occasions. So before a movie is screened in theaters, distributors often commission research. The most or best researched film in the world is Gone with the Wind, which was re-edited several dozen times to fit the research results so that it would evoke the emotions that were the point. We could also ask whether art requires research. Research cannot kill the artwork because an artwork is not a populist thing created to fit the tastes of the public purely. I don't think we've studied very artsy or art films. Most of our research has been on popular films. Maybe some of them were more ambitious, others less so. But one thing that came out of our research, and it wasn't eye tracking, it was more of classical research where we held interviews with viewers. They allowed us to answer basic questions like, is the work understandable to the viewer? Because I think that if the viewer fails to understand or simply doesn't get certain messages, then maybe these are grounds to fix something in the movie, in the work. And there were examples of such films. Where we managed to make some tweaks, not big changes, but maybe introducing captions or a comment. Sometimes it was a matter of the film title, whether the title would attract audiences, would bring in audiences or not. But in many cases, it's a matter of understanding. I remember we once studied a film, and I don't want to tell you the title exactly. There was a kind of daring artistic move involved. It was one of the variants. So let's say this was a movie that is set in the 19th century, and some of the scenes featured attributes of today's times, like a mobile phone or items that were essentially traveled back in time. And the directors wanted to see how this would be received. And it turned out that most of the viewers found it distracting, found it awkward, unacceptable. But the main problem was that it was just a bad film. And the audience didn't like it. So even this artistic device, this artistic move to introduce modern objects into the 19th century, that wasn't even the problem. It was simply a bad movie. A bad and boring movie. You asked to what extent new technologies help researchers, to what extent they might replace the researcher altogether eventually. It seems that it is always tempting to think that robots can replace humans. And many researchers burning the midnight oil to write their reports might dream of having a technology that would eliminate the need for that kind of work. There's also a need to facilitate research in terms of collecting information, but the main challenge that researchers currently face, it's not so much the application or the use of various technologies as convincing people to take part in research. There's a growing unwillingness to take part in market research. This might lead to a situation in which we are basing our research on specific individuals who differ from the fold, who are not representative of the whole population. Then this research will be worthless. And unfortunately, the technologies don't always succeed doing what they're expected to do. One popular thing that gave rise to discussions was having bots carry out phone interviews, and this is quite labor-intensive. You need interviewers, you need to pay them. So there was an idea to have a bot that would call people and ask them questions. and it would be interactive, it would react to responses. I think we've all encountered such bots because they are used by one of the photovoltaics companies on a mass scale, not for research obviously, but for sales. But the outcome was, well, highly unsatisfactory. So a bot could be useful if people wanted to take part in research in the first place, or bot-led research in particular. Some of these bots are extremely precise. We can, often the person on the phone isn't sure whether they're talking to a person or a bot. So they're quite human-like. A bot is capable of asking simple questions and receiving answers like yes or no. But often in our research, the questions are more complicated and the answers are more complex, and this is where we run into problems. The bot is not capable of properly interpreting words, say, and in many cases, the bots don't do well. Secondly, research has a schedule. If a company approaches this market research company, they want to get the information quickly. And unfortunately, teaching a bot, first of all, preparing the whole script, preparing the entire algorithm is a complicated process. It takes quite a lot of time than classical phone interviews. And also teaching the bot to interpret the responses in the proper way, that also takes a lot of time. So as a result, it turns out, there was even a comparison done in Poland between a bot interview and a classical normal human interview. It turned out that it took way too much time to use the bot. It was too cost-intensive, too costly, and bots are not used on a wide scale in Poland. There were also attempts to use bots in online research, but here we run into the very same problem. However, it doesn't mean that these technologies are not being introduced and that they're not moving the research process forward. Research is done using the online tools. There are internet panels. Also, thanks to the pandemic, this whole process accelerated, gained speed. When we were starting out some 20 years ago, this research was still in its infancy. But now most market research, most public opinion research relies on online tools or is done via the internet. But it's not something that replaces the human. Humans have to program the script. So I would say that it's like using a kind of technology, but in a classical way. So merely as a tool. So we need to ask whether, in each case, such technological innovations are suitable for our research work. I remember 10 years ago there was a huge boom for biometric research. There was a hype about biometrics. So not just eye tracking, but skin parameters, breathing, brain waves, and so on. And there were some gurus here in Poland who said that classical research is over, biometrics is the future, we're going to study brainwaves, etc. And classical research in which we ask questions, that's in the past. As it happens, only eye tracking stayed with us, as well as face tracking to some extent, but not on a huge scale. So qualitative research, eye tracking research are just a very small percentage of all research, whereas the other biometrics, parameter research simply didn't pan out. So asking people still remains the main method. This humanistic approach has stayed with us, even though all those technologies can be quite useful. There were also ideas to replace the human in classical individual one-on-one interviews or group interviews, for these to be done by a bot. It flopped. We need the human person there. And I think I'm the oldest of us all here on stage. I've been in market and public opinion research from the very beginning, since 1989. And on many occasions, people said, yes, we are about to have a technological breakthrough. The new technologies will eliminate this and that, which never happened. I was quite surprised. I was in London recently. I picked up a Financial Times, and I look. There's a press questionnaire printed there. And I thought, well, this is ancient history. This is way outdated. This is a method from 50, 60 years ago. But it's, well, lo and behold, it's still around. So new solutions overlap with the old. For instance, Zoom has been has proven quite handy for conducting public opinion research. During the pandemic, both group interviews and individual interviews were set up that way on Zoom. And even though we're out of the pandemic now, we're post-pandemic, the technology stayed. So I think it's true that the technological acceleration was related to the pandemic, but there are also, the classical methods are still around, very much so. Also from the standpoint of those commissioning the research, this is very handy for them. They don't have to travel all across the country, and they can talk to people via Zoom. So there are various factors that make this convenient, but we also must keep in mind that these technologies are seeping in as technology becomes acculturated, or we become acculturated to technology. Over a dozen years ago, when we were starting online research, the biggest limitation was that only around 10% of Poles used the internet. Right now, it's around 85 or even 90% of Poles, which opens up a way bigger field and allows us to do more credible, reliable research, more representative research. But it doesn't mean that online research has eliminated other research methods. So here I think that we will be seeing a sort of an interweaving of old solutions and new technologies. However, it won't eliminate the researcher. It's merely an aid, a research aid. So if we deem that the research subjects or respondents are currently online, then we'll need to find them online and interview them there. But the researcher himself won't be replaced by a bot. So let's say somebody says, let's find out about people's opinions on this particular topic. Let's use a bot. The bot will plan what questions to ask. It'll write a report and so on. No, I don't think that will ever happen in the foreseeable future. Could I just throw in an anecdote? We need transdisciplinarity and many methods. The old methods, technology won't use the old methods. Modern biometric research uses MRI to do brain imaging. And there's an anecdote I often tell students. One of our part-time students who studies in another faculty, she was asked to take part in an empathy study using MRI, and it came out that our student is a sociopath. She showed no emotions where it would have been expected, and indeed the brain scans showed that she was irritated or even kind of felt this was ridiculous. So what would have happened if we hadn't done a personal interview with her to ask her about her reactions? This is a person who deals with photography, and her brain was just thinking, these are really bad photographs. These are very poor quality of photos. So this was not a person who was simply susceptible to that kind of study. So, and we wouldn't have been able to establish that without a deeper interview. The bot would simply have concluded that she is a sociopath. So the same goes for studying art or film. We need interviews. We need the researcher's intuition, or also the keeping the aim in sight. Why are we doing this? What can we use eye tracking or face reading for in studying a certain film frame? Or, for instance, as filmmakers, sometimes we want to make sure that arranging certain things on a table that attract attention. And in addition, we have cognitive dissonance that the foods, the dishes don't go together. And the research subjects cannot say or recall what the people around the table were talking about because they were so engrossed by looking at what is on that table. So their attention was riveted to the dishes on the table. So, for instance, I was tempted to look at the series The Young Pope, and I found myself looking at the action in the background and the artistically bent trees, and then I had to keep pausing, because I couldn't register what the characters were talking about. So there was a plot of some kind, an intrigue, while I was looking at the nuns in the background. And maybe somebody wants to obtain that kind of effect, but maybe that's not desirable. So research checking what the experience is like needs a lot of transdisciplinary approaches or trans-methodological approaches with great openness and a lot of distance, and also the sense that this research is not conclusive. When we finish one study, we often have ideas on what to do next. It is standard in Polish and international journals to state what further directions this can go in. So technology changes our research. As we've said, new methods, new techniques are being created without eliminating the older ones, creating a broader repertoire. But what is symptomatic when speaking of marketing research, the computer-assisted CAPTCHA and whatever research are starting to drive out questionnaires. Like you said, in the Financial Times, the newspaper questionnaire that seemed very old-fashioned. The aim determines the means, but I think the CATHI or CAVI research will develop will certainly develop. So the internet as a field of research and a research tool, the internet panels were created with Krzysztof Franek, who is here in the room, and Adam represents a research agency that has the biggest internet panel. And I remember reading about this before my PhD. It was important that we have the means to check who we are studying with those panels. There is high responsiveness. In Scandinavia, most research is done this way. So we need to motivate the respondent, encourage them. So I think technology might be an aspect that is conducive to building a better image of marketing research. Whereas the author of the research project always remains the author, the one who sets the framework, and the technology has less capacity to replace the human. Research is also all about communicating. Art is a type of conversation, a type of communication. And because we have Małgosia with us, who represents a VR agency, I would like to ask you, Małgosia, about your opinion. How do you see the development of new technologies, especially VR, but not just that? But VR is your field. How is it changing marketing communication on the broader scale?
Okay, good morning. I represent an agency that produces VR and AR content. I've been doing that for 4 years, and I was wondering what to tell you, how to summarize what we've been doing. I realized that ever since I'm in the business, I've been hearing that now's the time when we'll all have VR goggles. I remember those forecasts that didn't happen. Goggles are used by gamers or people with kids, as we know from experience when we talk to clients and interested parties. Those are the people who have goggles. Even today, we have people who put on the goggles for the first time, even though it would seem that it's an established technology. People have been at a festival, at a museum, or gaming, that they've had an experience of goggles, but we still have people for who need to be introduced to the technology. AR has a lower threshold. During the pandemic, we had more interest in new technology from culture institutions or business clients who wanted to engage with their clients or customers, and they couldn't invite them. And for obvious reasons, AR was easier because you can use it on your phone or on your tablet. So AR, when I try to, I say Pokemon Go, and everybody knows, even people who haven't played the game, it was so popular. We know that it's simple, that it's easy, that if kids and adults play it, then it's a technology that we can use. And my experience shows that the greatest challenge is to decide what we want to do with the technology. We are getting a lot of interest, and my everyday at Cinematic VR, it's never boring. Every question is different. It's always a new business, a new application. So when working on these projects, we have to do with clients with different degrees of literacy. It's like websites. If we have a client who wants to commission a website, they know what the website should contain, what it shouldn't contain. But if we're writing a VR or AR application, then it often turns out that clients don't know what's possible. They don't know what will work, what is feasible, or what will look good, what the customer will understand. So it's a back and forth. For me, every project is a learning experience. I know how to communicate certain and what to focus on. It's interesting because I personally don't always know how to interpret facts. We don't do traditional research, but we always do testing at the beginning of a project. First, it's closed. We do beta testing, and then we give it to the client, and we have all sorts of feedback. Two examples of different AR applications, a game, something like Pokemon Go. One was done for shopping malls. Parents would take their kids shopping, and the kids could play a game. So there was no motivation there. Another game had prizes, so it had a specific purpose. And we did these in a similar way. After we launched the applications, the feedback was different. For the client who was interested in the game, they said that they had no problems. Users understood the interface. Everybody knew what to do, where to click. And eye tracking, of course, when designing the interface, we have to know where people will look if we want to design it well. So it wasn't a problem. But in the shopping mall, everything was a challenge. Actually, users didn't read the onboarding. They didn't know what to do, where to click. They didn't have any comparable experience, so it wasn't intuitive. They didn't know that if you have a menu, like now move your phone over the floor, now click here to get an animal. People didn't read the instructions because they weren't motivated. There was no prize, no reward. Even so, two identical or very similar applications, the response was different. For the application with the prizes, people brought their families. They would leave their kids and just run off to win the prize. So that was interesting. It's a fascinating period, what's happening in VR and AR. We don't really know which way the technology will go. Events such as the pandemic are changing our customs, our habits. We have more users of AR than VR. It might balance out, even out eventually. Experience shows me that the technologies are headed in different directions for business and public institutions. VR is used for training. If we want full immersion, if we want to cut someone off from the real world for a moment, if we want to do a course, if we want to make them aware of any hazardous situations or something dangerous that we can show them safely in virtual reality, then we can map the decisions, the reactions. We have a training system that allows us to collect these responses and to see what works and what doesn't. So that's one aspect. We also have VR films. We're doing a project for the Labor Office. We're filming 45 different trades, and we want to show teenagers, school levers what a trade involves, not just a description, but an immersive experience of working a given trade, of having a job. And as for AR, the threshold is much lower. Like I said, all you need is a phone or a tablet, and shortly, soon, I suppose, comfortable glasses, because all the tech companies are working on their glasses. Even smaller companies are writing software that's light, software for glasses, and VR goggles are burdensome, are cumbersome, and it's not comfortable, and not everybody knows how to use that. But AR allows us to do a lot more in marketing or in sales. We have virtual changing rooms. You can try on shoes. You can design and decorate your interior. Consulting, working with clients. So if something breaks down, you can film a broken down piece of equipment, and the consultant uses an AR filter. They show us how to repair the device. We have entertainment applications. We have something that was made popular in social media, like filters. We all play around with filters. We do that as well, I suppose, and we do that for various clients. It's a fascinating time, and if somebody were to ask me 3 years ago, before the pandemic, which way the technology would go and what the greatest challenge facing us would be, my answer would have been entirely different. So we're working with a living body. Every project, every hardware, it's all developing, and it all changes our perception. It changes the way we use these things. Because, for instance, there will be goggles on the market that will be cheaper, more accessible, and that'll give us access to interesting content. The users will buy that product. It won't be a gadget for gaming, because at the moment that's how it's seen. Maybe artists will find it easier. They'll find a new platform to reach viewers with their content. I mean, platforms exist, but they're not as popular as they could be. So you have a lot of points, a lot of things that shortly, in a year or two, will come together, and we'll have a new research material, and our habits, our behaviors will be changing. Thank you. So that statement shows how new technology can, on the one hand, draw in customers and clients, and also have an educational and promotional function. This is interesting because reports and communication is also evolving, a partnership-based communication. It's not just informing and manipulating, but also educating. And that's an opportunity to summarize what you've said. I think that it's worth stressing that education is artistic education, and also viewer education, but also manager education, how to use technology to create works that will accomplish their purpose. So people and have knowing viewers, but also you need marketing mechanisms to learn more about users and to develop the market. And since time is of the essence, we are ending exactly on time. Anya asked us to stick to the time. We have 2 more panels ahead of us today, and there are also events at the school. So thank you for inviting me. Thank you for this panel, for your interesting statements. And you can, of course, approach us afterwards And now it's over to Anna Schiller, who will announce the next item. Thank you, Marta, for this interesting panel. Speaking of perceiving, perception of culture, all I can do is encourage you to enjoy culture. You can view the exhibition in this building and in the new media building. And now let's have a brief coffee break, and then we'll tell you what's next. We'll tell you what's in store for us in the future, what the VN Lab is planning. So see you then.